Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we'd love a comment about how you found us. Please? Those who serve in the military don't have the luxury of freedom. When a superior officer gives an order, it must be followed. However, soldiers are human too. Sometimes they don't do what they are told. And when they run away from military service, it is a crime known as desertion. Today, most deserters are sent to prison, but in World War II, one man paid the ultimate price for his transgression. Today, we are going to tell you the story of the last man the United States military executed for desertion. The history of desertion. Every major conflict has seen its share of soldiers that run away rather than fight. Despite rigorous training and the threat of severe punishment, some people cannot be convinced to stand and face the enemy. The United States has been in a lot of wars. Every one of them has seen its share of deserters. But the reasons why aren't always straightforward. The War of 1812 didn't end until 1815. The desertion rate for soldiers in the conflict was around 13%. However, it wasn't necessarily cowardice that drove many of them to do it. The enlistment bonus was increased in 1814, so many soldiers ran away, then re-enlisted to get another bonus. The Mexican-American War took place from 1846 to 1848. The desertion rate during this conflict was about 8%. As with the previous war, some men ran away, then re-enlisted to get another bonus. Other soldiers disappeared because the camps were full of disease and filth. A few enterprising individuals used the military to hitch a ride to California, where they then ran away to search for gold. As the Civil War began, some of the bloodiest battles in human history raged. Soldiers on both sides of the conflict fled from their units when possible. Several of those who were caught running away were sentenced to death, then killed by firing squad. Others were simply returned to the front lines. After the Civil War ended, desertion was handled differently. Usually it resulted in humiliation and a prison sentence, but during times of war, the threat of death remained an option. During World War I, 2,657 men were convicted of desertion. 24 of them were sentenced to death. Woodrow Wilson commuted their sentences in 1918 before they could be carried out. World War II would create a small army of deserters. Over 20,000 soldiers were convicted of abandoning their assigned posts. Of those, 49 were sentenced to death. 48 of the offenders had their sentence commuted, but one among them would become the first person to be executed for desertion since the Civil War. Early life. Eddie Slovik was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1920. He displayed an aptitude for crime at a young age. When he was just 12 years old, Eddie broke into a factory and stole brass. He was caught, but it didn't stop him from pursuing a life of crime. By 1937, Eddie had been arrested several times for a variety of offenses. For the most part, he liked to break into buildings and steal things. After standing trial for his numerous crimes, Eddie was sent to prison in October 1937. He was paroled in September 1938. However, freedom apparently didn't agree with Eddie. He started drinking, then stole a car and crashed it. By January 1939, he was back in prison. He didn't remain in prison forever and was eventually released in April 1942. Instead of returning to a life of crime, Eddie decided to try living like a law-abiding citizen. He started working at a plumbing company in Dearborn, Michigan. While working at his new job, Eddie found himself attracted to the bookkeeper. Her name was Antoinette Wisniewski. The two were married on November 7th, 1942. It looked like the couple might enjoy a long and prosperous marriage. They were both employed, and thanks to a long criminal record, Eddie was not eligible to serve in the military. However, the war produced a lot of casualties. Before long, the United States military needed new recruits to replace those who were injured or killed. The government decided Eddie's criminal past no longer mattered. He was drafted into service on January 3, 1944. Desertion. On January 24, 1944, Eddie arrived at Camp Walters, Texas for basic training. By July 11th, his training was complete. He then waited at Fort Meade, Maryland for his inevitable trip to Europe. On August 25th, he finally found himself in German-occupied France. Eddie was ordered to join his new unit on the front lines in Elbeuf, France. As he walked to join them, the Germans mounted an artillery attack. Eddie took cover and stayed there long after the attack ended. By the next morning, his fellow soldiers were long gone. As he entered the town, Eddie found it was now occupied by Canadians. He turned himself over to the military police. He remained with them for 6 weeks. Eddie was finally returned to the U.S. Army on October 7th. While Eddie had been under the care of Canadian soldiers, the U.S. Army was busy fighting Germans in Hurtgen Forest. Casualties were extremely high. Eddie was going to be one of the replacement troops, and he knew that if he had to fight, he might very well die. On October 8th, Eddie told his commander that he was too scared to fight on the front lines. Instead of being met with compassion, he was ordered to join the rest of his unit and fight as ordered. The next day, Eddie walked away from his assigned unit. Several miles away, he approached a cook and gave him a note. "I confess to the desertion of the United States Army. At the time of my desertion, we were in Elbeuf in France. I came to Elbeuf as a replacement. They were shelling the town and we were told to dig in for the night. The following morning they were shelling us again. I was so scared, nerves, and trembling that at the time the other replacements moved out, I couldn't move. I stayed there in my foxhole till it was quiet and I was able to move. I then walked into town. Not seeing any of our troops, so I stayed overnight at a French hospital. The next morning I turned myself over to the Canadian Provost Corps. After being with them 6 weeks, I was turned over to American MP. They turned me loose. I told my commanding officer my story. I said that if I had to go out there again, I'd run away. He said there was nothing he could do for me, so I ran away again, and I'll run away again if I have to go out there." Court-martial. After reading Eddie's note, the cook went and found an officer. Eventually, the company commander was notified. He told Eddie that if he destroyed the note, then everyone would forget it ever happened. Unfortunately, Eddie meant every word. He was not going to back down. He was taken into custody. By the next day, Lieutenant Colonel Ross Henbest became aware of what was happening. He gave Eddie another chance to destroy the note and return to his unit. Eddie again refused to take this offer. Finally, Eddie was brought before the judge advocate. The judge gave him a third and final chance to return to his unit and forget about deserting. He gave this answer: "I've made up my mind. I'll take my court-martial." Eddie believed that the worst they'd do to him was send him to prison. He didn't expect what happened next. On November 11th, 1944, he was put on trial. The case was heard by staff officers who never faced combat. Normally, Eddie would have been judged by other combat soldiers. But they were all busy fighting the Germans. The officers that heard Eddie's case found him guilty, but instead of giving him time in prison, he was sentenced to death. Major General Norman Cotto is the division commander. He had to review the death sentence. In the end, he approved it. Later, he commented on the decision: "Given the situation as I knew it in November 1944, I thought it was my duty to this country to approve that sentence. If I hadn't approved it, if I had let Slovik accomplish his purpose, I don't know how I could have gone up to the line and looked a good soldier in the face." Eddie realized that time was running out. On December 9th, he sent a letter to General Dwight D. Eisenhower begging for mercy. He promised to be a good soldier if only given another chance. But, unknown to him, desertion was becoming a big problem for the U.S. Army in France. Eisenhower decided it was appropriate that Eddie Slovik should be killed. He would serve as an example for other soldiers that might consider desertion an option. Execution and aftermath. On the morning of January 31st, 1945, Eddie Slovik was scheduled to die by firing squad. He spoke to the soldiers that prepared him for his appointment with death. "They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army. Thousands of guys have done that. They just need to make an example out of somebody, and I'm it because I'm an ex-con. I used to steal things when I was a kid, and that's what they are shooting me for. They're shooting me for the bread and chewing gum I stole when I was 12 years old." He was taken to the site of his execution. Then he was strapped to a post. Right before the executioner put a black hood over his head, the chaplain leaned over and said, "Eddie, when you get up there, say a little prayer for me." Eddie replied, "Okay, Father. I'll pray that you don't follow me too soon." As the soldiers discharged their weapons, Eddie was hit by 11 bullets. The doctor checked, but Eddie wasn't dead. The soldiers began reloading their weapons. Before they could finish, Eddie died. The entire execution took 15 minutes. Instead of being sent home, Eddie was buried alongside other executed soldiers. They had been killed for committing rape or murder. Antoinette Slovik survived her husband, but she spent her life in poverty and never remarried. In 1974, lawyers petitioned the government on Antoinette's behalf. Her health was failing and she was extremely poor, but nothing was done to assist her. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter tried to help by sponsoring legislation that would have finally paid her, but Antoinette died before the Senate could vote on it. In a strange twist of fate, in the weeks after Eddie's execution, many of the staff officers that passed judgment on him were captured and became prisoners of war. One of them, Benedict B. Kinnelman, wrote the following in 1987. "A few weeks after I had voted for the death sentence for Slovik as a member of the court, I was captured in the Bulge battle and didn't know of his execution until after my release from a German prison camp. In prison, we often talked about the case. I can't say positively what I would have done if I had still been with the division in January 1945, but the experiences in the Battle of the Bulge altered my views. I came to believe that frontline offenses ought to be judged only by frontline personnel. At trial time, we had not been a court of frontline personnel. He got a fair trial under the circumstances, but in retrospect, the circumstances were not fair. I believe I would have tried to do whatever was in my power to get the entire case reviewed on this basis." Soon after this was published, President Ronald Reagan ordered that Eddie's remains should be returned to the United States. Before the year was over, he was reburied. He now occupies the burial plot next to his wife. So far, at least, Eddie Slovik is the last person in the United States military to be executed for desertion. Did Eddie deserve his fate, or was it unfair that he was sentenced to death? Let us know what you think. We are very curious to learn how our viewers feel about this one. Normally, this is the part of the episode where we beg you to become a patron or make a donation, and it would certainly be great if you did that. But even if you don't want to share your hard-earned dollars with us, you can still help our strange little history channel grow. Hit the like button. Not just on this video, but on several others too. Comment as much as you can. With your help, we can make the YouTube algorithm believe that this is the place where people should come to learn about the horrible past. Most of all, thank you for watching Bad Things in History.